secondary title to your book actually leads me to this question. You talk about war on the West prevailing in the age of unreason. I've thought a lot about this, Douglas, and I've thought about this anti-racist movement and the way it attacks such fundamental, foundational principles of so much that for me it seems even bigger than what we would call the West, or at least the way I think you defined the West. You did touch on this. The tradition going back to the Greeks of depending upon reason and rationality. It seems to me in a lot of ways what we're actually talking about is the Enlightenment, is the foundation of what ended up being Western civilization. And in that way, wouldn't the war be not just against Britons and Canadians and Australians and Americans, but it would also be against Italians and Spanish and any civilization that built its foundation on the Enlightenment?
Yes, absolutely. You're quite right. As I say, I mean, I sort of highlight the Anglosphere countries, the Anglophone countries, because what I'm describing is actually a lot worse here. I mean, I should stress there are lots of different types of anti-Westernism. There's Arab anti-Westernism, there's Chinese anti-Westernism. What I'm particularly focused on is Western anti-Westernism, the movement within the West to tear down the West. The people done primarily by people of the West, including very prominently white people in the West waging war on the thing that they've inherited. But I mention that because it's very important to recognize where it's worst. It's worst in America, and it's second most worst in all of the countries which are English speaking, because they imbibe American culture so much. They imbibe it a lot more than France or Spain or Italy does, for better or for worse. On this occasion, it's for worse when people manage to download the American virus here. So you get movements like BLM, like the so-called anti-racist, you get them first in other English-speaking countries, in Canada, in Britain. It's in these places that they basically replay American viruses in their own tone. Other countries have got versions of this. France has, but it's noticeable that there is also a pushback against it from a very high level. No less a figure than the president of the Republic of France, Emmanuel Macron, has said in the last couple of years, we must not import this American wokeness. Wokeness, I don't particularly like the thing. I think it's too frivolous for what I'm really talking about here, which is a very much deeper strata of argument and war against us. But Macron says we can't afford in France to download this American virus, So other countries that are not English-speaking are better at protecting themselves, it seems to me. Most dangerous is America. Most dangerous are the countries immediately affected by America.
Yeah, I've heard you say America is a net exporter of this woke ideology. Yes. And I like that you say that the term woke almost does a disservice to the conversation we're having, because what we're having is much deeper and more important than the sort of trendy terminology of wokeism. I want to talk about comparative sin for just one moment, and I'm going to try to leave no string dangling here. But you've talked about this, and this is sort of why I went to the age of the Enlightenment, because Spain obviously was a big participant in the Atlantic slave trade. I believe the Portuguese were really one of the underpinnings of the Atlantic slave trade. And if you look at the number of slaves that were traded to Brazil, a Portuguese colony, versus the number of slaves traded to America, an English colony, it pales in comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's and very strange that Brazil doesn't have people saying that Brazil should tear itself apart, destroy its history, and pay reparations to pay for its slave trade. I mean, it's very
So
weird.
Why is that, Douglas? And that's why I went back to the Enlightenment. You don't see this movement in Spain. You don't see it in France. You don't see it in Italy. You don't see it in other countries who are the inheritees of the Enlightenment. You see it in the English-speaking sphere. Why?
Well, I believe that it's because we've got our own history in the West uniquely out of proportion. Uniquely in America. America is particularly bad in understanding not just its own history, but the context of its own history. Let me explain what I mean. As far as I know, America is the only country which at the moment in the developed world has a serious dispute about when it was founded. This isn't happening even in Britain. It's not happening in France, it's not happening in Spain. Right now. It's America that is having a serious dispute caused by its alleged paper of record, the New York Times, about when the Republic of America should be regarded as having started. Should we say that it was started by the founders, or should we say that it was founded when the first slaves came into the American continent in 1619? Well, a significant number of Americans believe that we should do that latter, take that latter course, that 1619 is more important than 1776, and that we should regard America as being born into this original sin. Now, I'm afraid that a lot of Americans have fallen for this. A lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, have fallen for this. They don't know about the slave trade that Brazil was engaged in. They don't know it was going on much longer than the American slave trade, that Brazil was still slave trading into the 1880s. They don't know that what America was doing in having slavery was what every civilization in history had done up till then, what everyone was still doing. They don't know that during the same time that the transatlantic slave trade was going on, far more people from Africa were stolen by their neighbors in Africa and sold to the Arab slave trade. Why don't they know this? Nobody tells them this. I don't think one in a million Americans know this fact. So particularly young Americans are being encouraged to take their own history out of context, and as a result, to think that their own history is uniquely and especially bad. And this is a very interesting change, Will, that has gone on in our lifetimes. See, I think we were both brought up still in the era where America thought well of itself, recognized it had made mistakes, recognized that people in its history had made mistakes, as who doesn't, but recognized that, broadly speaking, the American project was a positive one. I have a book on the shelf behind me, Paul Johnson's History of the American People. And Paul Johnson's History of the American People was published only 20 years ago. It begins by saying, the American story is one of the great stories of humankind, perhaps the greatest. It is impossible to imagine that a mainstream history of America written in 2022 would dare to start from that premise. Everything has been turned on its head in our own lifetimes, very swiftly, very negatively, in a very evil way, in my view.
Yes, and you're right. I did grow up. I don't know if I grew up in an age. I'm not sure what we thought as Gen Xers here in America in the collective, but I certainly, within my culture, my family, and with my individual analysis, saw America as a uniquely positive advancement in human civilization, the enshrinement of those Enlightenment values in a founding document. I honestly think that the American founding stands there with the Magna Carta and other great moments in history where we said, no, there are individual rights that you are imbued with, and codifying that were great advancements in human civilization. Now, look, we weren't perfect. Obviously, we made, and I don't mean to make light, we made, by saying we weren't perfect, we were less than perfect. We did not advance those ideals for every single member of our society. And I think it's fascinating, though, that you point out, as do I, that doesn't make us unique within history. In fact, that makes us common. Now, that's not to excuse our sins. It is to say, like you said about Marx earlier, America was a product of its time. And whether or not you're talking about Cuba or Brazil or Portugal or Spain, the world was colonialist and tribalist and racist. And your explanation to me, Douglas, for why America is going through this, despite that commonality in world history, is ignorance. You said, we don't know. Americans don't grow up knowing about the Arab slave trade. But here's where I would push you a slight bit. I can't imagine Brazilians know a great amount about the Arab slave trade any more than Americans. And yet we don't see the same thing happening in Brazil. We don't see the same thing happening in Spain and in Portugal.
Absolutely. Well, there's a reason, which is, as I say, the ignorance. I should have got onto this. The ignorance has something else driving it, which is people who want us to be ignorant and to take advantage of it. What do I mean by that? You just described, I don't like the description of it, we were never perfect. Well, who was? Who is? What society is perfect? We're human beings, we live on planet Earth. Nothing is perfect. We're not perfect. No person is perfect.